The rule of the game is that I'm giving the role of starting with the questions or with the comments. So I will do before giving the mic to the floor. Let me first say that this is a great book. We have to discuss later on about whether we'll have something of the 5 cents per page that you referred to at the beginning. But I mean, really, this is a great book, and I recommend that very, very strongly. That book. There is a lot of things. I mean, it's extremely complete, very thoughtful everywhere. So it's a very fantastic achievement. The comments I have are really very general comments, not specific to some part of the book or some technical aspect of the book. From your presentation, I would like to start maybe from the challenges at the end. Whether you have to be pessimistic or optimistic. It seems to me that today, when we look at the recent history, it is true that people tend to be optimistic in global poverty because the 2000s have been very good years for developing countries. And in particular because commodity prices were very high. Those countries were able to get much higher revenue from exporting their commodities. They were able to spend more, possibly on investment, on other things. And what we have seen in terms of economic growth during those 10 years, let's say, is the gross impact of this improvement in aggregate demand in those countries. Now, commodity prices are much lower. They may be low for quite some time. If we look at the whole evolution of commodity prices in the long run, we have seen very, very long periods during which commodity prices were low. And I would say that today, the issue in global poverty is very much whether those countries will be able to grow, whether those countries will find an engine of growth that will allow them to avoid getting back to the situation in which they were in the 90s. And this is not obvious. I mean, in your presentation, you mentioned, for example, agriculture. I fully agree. I mean, it's absolutely essential for the growth of these countries that they should be able to invest or to produce more of traded goods. The goods for which there is no need to have some demand to start with. And this is agriculture, this is manufacturing. And today, we don't see very much this kind of dynamism in those economies. So in the challenges and in the policies, I would say that macro policies which would be able to incentivize this kind of aggregate behavior are quite important. Global policies, international agreements that will permit those countries to get into that. Today it is not clear. I mean, if you look at the trade agreements, there is in many cases those countries cannot really protect themselves easily from the imports coming from other countries, including China. So there is something to be done there, and I mean, you and I have worked on the elasticity of poverty with respect to GDP growth. This is part of the story. If there is no GDP growth, then poverty will not go down as quickly as possible, as it has been the case before. So this is the first point. The second point is the following. I'm just coming back this morning from Tanzania, and I spent the whole week talking to people, all types of people. And one very interesting phenomenon in the case of Tanzania, they had the same acceleration of growth as many other sub-Saharan African countries during the 2000s. They grew more or less at 6-7% every year, with a demographic growth rate which is around 2.8. This means that they had, for the first time for a long time, they had an increase in income per capita. Yet, when you look at poverty statistics, no change. So this growth, I mean, from that point of view, the parallel with the United States is perfect. In the United States, we know that most of the growth has been completely confiscated by the top 1% of the population for the last 30 years. Here, it is not the last 30 years, it is the last 10 or 15 years, but you have the same phenomenon. And moreover, when instead of looking poverty in $1.90 a day, you look at the multidimensional poverty index, which is adding some deprivation, the field of education, the field of health, etc., then it is worse because poverty has increased. So this means that, indeed, as you said, I mean, in your presentation, inequality is absolutely important. And this ties with your argument about absolute versus relative poverty. I'm not sure that the argument is really absolute per se versus relative per se. Let's say that in the case of Tanzania, we would observe that poverty has been going down by 2%, at the same time as income was going up by 5%. This means that we should have expected that poverty should have gone down more or less than 5%. And the fact that it didn't mean that the additional income, the additional potential in that economy was not used to reduce poverty. And this is, it seems to me, a different attitude, different concept as saying we are comparing to the others. If what you have in mind is a pure Rawlsian kind of value judgment, if you look at the fate of the poorest, the fact that the poorest didn't benefit as much as others from growth means that it would have been better to have a better achievement in Rawlsian terms. And it is in that sense that I believe that absolute poverty and relative poverty are, absolute inequality and inequality is important because what is behind that is essentially inequality. So I was very pleased to see the emphasis that you put on this at the end of the presentation, the fact that inequality is really a central part of all this. This is something that we have discussed many, many times. But I think that this argument in Rawlsian terms is really very, very important. It is not because we are making progress in poverty that things are satisfactory. If it had been possible to do better, why didn't we do better? And the last point, very general point that I wanted to make is the following. And this is maybe more a point on the developed countries and the future of redistribution and anti-poverty policies, although it may also apply to developing countries. I mean, and the idea is what is in front of us in terms of the society we will be living in, or maybe you will be living in. I think that I will not be there anymore, in 15, 20, 25 years. If it is the case, as many people are expecting it, that we are going toward a more robotized society, that jobs are disappearing. There was the last McKinsey report say that they are expecting 18 million jobs, medium-skilled jobs, to disappear in the US in the coming 10 years or something like that. Now, if this is the case, if labor becomes difficult, I mean, if getting a job is becoming difficult, then our whole redistribution system, which is somehow based on labor, will have to be completely rethought. And in particular, when in the book you talk about the basic income argument, saying, okay, why don't we have a system in which we give everybody some basic income, and then if you want to get more, you'll get more. I have a feeling that this kind of idea may become much more pregnant in the future than it is the case today. And this is interesting because this ties with what you said about universality, etc., etc. And this may not be completely irrelevant in the case of developing countries, if indeed the problem in those countries is that because of the nature of economic growth, there will be no engine of growth that will generate all the jobs that are needed. I mean, think about Africa with the 2.8% growth rate in Tanzania, and it is not an exception. Okay, fertility rate is 5.4 children per woman, and with this, you double the population in 25, 30 years. Now, what will they do with this population? And if you want to fight poverty, this means that what does exist today will have to be amplified, multiplied, and probably the nature of the policies will have to be modified. These are very, very general comments. If you feel like reacting to that, you're welcome. And then we open up.
I thought probably a good idea to open up. I've said a lot already.
So let's have a open discussion. Is that okay? Yeah.
I mean, okay, if you want to say a few words about this, then we have the open discussion, as you want.
No, I think let's open it up.
Okay, good.
I mean, I feel like I've
okay, so who wants to intervene, make remarks, questions?
I jump because it's easier to ask the first question. So the first question would be, it's maybe related a little on that. It's on political economy. You talked about education and polo, you know, and anti-polo and education, and how the establishment was afraid of raising this poor, and then on the challenge, and you talked also about elite capture, but could you more elite capture on urban planning, but could you develop more on this political economy of anti-poverty policies, and what do you see on that? What kind of if there's something like that?
Okay, let's pick up another question here, another there. Sorry.
Hello, my name is Franz. I come from Peru. And yesterday I was watching a movie. It's called The Short List, and they were kind of like the feeling you have at the end of the movie is that the financial sector is irresponsible on their behaving and decision making. And how much do you think they explain the increase of poverty, or how much on the other side do they contribute to decrease poverty? I have this question because I feel that the world is becoming more capitalistic in some way. In some way it's getting challenged, but I mean, I had that feeling. It's like, wow, if they're behaving that way, it's like, what is gonna happen, so.
Okay, Denis.
I had kind of related question to Akiko's one, so perhaps it's good to have it in a row. So you started your intervention on the history of economic thought about poverty, and you said something that struck me, that we had reached kind of a consensus around the idea that poverty reduction is good for society, right? So and with that, we shifted away from fatalism, and at the same time also from mere opposition, frontal opposition of the kind of industrialists that you mentioned to social protection. But then I wondered to which extent this consensus is so hard, and to which extent that consensus is very hard, and to which extent it shifted, well, the debate then shifted to the level at which we should define who is poor and who is not poor. And do you think also that these questions are solved? And do you think that all the debate around the policy questions now revolves about inequality reduction rather than poverty reduction? Or so are you completely optimistic about the idea that there will no debate around poverty reduction will ever come back? And also talking about well, you say it's a consensus, but among who? Perhaps a consensus within the donors or the international community? Is it so much consensus within a number of countries? Is it so true that many governments in developing countries, in particular, are really in the consensus? And so I wonder to which extent you could be as optimistic as you are about this consensus being reached, because to some extent you mentioned that the political economy of poverty reduction is still a great issue, the construction of the state, of an administrative capacity. So to some extent, to which extent does it help to have a consensus about poverty reduction if people do not share the same notion of what is poverty?
Do we want to take another question before you take this one? There is a question over there at the gentleman at the back.
Thank you very much for your insight. My first question is about the basic income. You said that it was relevant also for developing countries. So maybe you are implying some transfer of wealth from developed countries to the developing countries. How do you think it could be enforced on the already developed countries? My second question is about engines of growth on developing countries. I would say that developing countries basically it's not a concept. Let us take Tunisia as a country. So it is a developing country, as we are on the House of Tunisia, and China. Should Tunisia follow the path of China? Tunisia went through import substitution, industrialization in the 60s, then opened up its economy in the 70s, and now it's facing a huge problem. It has a savings glut, it is exposed to a cyclical economy, and it cannot compete with Chinese labor and Chinese technology and Chinese capital. Should Tunisia aim for investments in R&D and compete with Germany? I don't know. Or should it just lower or do some social dumping and try to compete with China or right now Vietnam? Thank you.
Okay, maybe you could.
Okay. I never think I'm very good at answering questions. This lecture in Stockholm yesterday, I think was about the best I've ever done, but let me try and maintain that momentum. I liked all of Francois's points. I don't have really much to add. I fully agree on finding alternative sources of growth is key, and sources of growth that don't require high commodity prices. We understand that, and developing new sources of exports is going to be key. I agree on the point of absolute and relative, no issue there. And I really like the third point, and it's something I've been thinking about in the course too, because I've got these millennials, these young students who, late teens, early 20s, who are really facing a far riskier world than I had when I was their age. And the implication of that, and the nature of labour markets and the way they've changed in America and are changing elsewhere, France is resisting that change. Very interesting to see what happens. Maybe France will be one of the few places that are successful in resisting that change, but I am sceptical. But we'll see. But the implications of that change for social policy are profound, and what are we going to see, and what alternative social policies will emerge. And the idea of the momentum that the basic income movement has got today comes in part, I think, from that realization. And the momentum is coming out of a consensus across both the left and the right. It's the other interesting thing. If you look at the supporters of basic income guarantees, it spans the political spectrum. It's not yet enough to get the policy change. I mean, the Swiss are voting on this in a couple of months. There's a referendum, a basic income guarantee for all Swiss citizens of $2,500 per person per month. When I tell my students, undergraduates, that, I can see their eyes light up. How do you get Swiss citizenship? And I tell them it's really difficult. But amazing. Now, of course, as an economist, the first thing you've got to say, and this links to one of the questions that was asked, how are you going to finance this? That's part of the problem here. And, if you're going to finance a basic income guarantee with a progressive income tax, that's a very nice idea, but take note that all those nice properties of the basic income guarantee for an economist, the fact that there's nothing you can do to change the amount of money you get, so there's no, the incentive effects are very weak, all you get is the income effect, you don't get any of the other incentive effects, distortion, I hate that word, but I'll just use it. You don't get any of those, you get all those desirable properties, but of course they're all going to come back with the financing. And this is important to realize. And if you finance a basic income guarantee with a progressive income tax, it's formally identical to Milton Friedman's negative income tax, which is maybe why we're getting this broad consensus. That's not a bad thing if that's the outcome of all this. The other point I'd make is that I think the idea is equally relevant to poor countries. My point about Sweden's economic history, as I understand it, and I'm an amateur here, but as I understand it, starting with universal programs, basic income guarantee is like the ultimate universal program. You know, everybody gets exactly the same amount. By the way, if you're under 18, you don't actually get the money, it accumulates in a bank account, and when you turn 18, you get a big lump sum. My students love that aspect of it too. Anyway, you've got to think of all these aspects, but it's no less relevant in developing countries. I mean, I take the basic income guarantee as a counterfactual for my assessments of anti-poverty policy in all my work. For example, I use it as the counterfactual for the National Employment Guarantee Scheme in India. If that scheme doesn't generate assets of value to poor people, in other words, if it's only unproductive workfare, it's not actually as good. You take the same budget, you finance it by killing that program, you take the same budget and allocate it as a basic income guarantee, you would have more impact on poverty. You've got no targeting, you give the same sum of money to everybody. That's because of the costs, the hidden, some explicit, some implicit, the costs of this very complicated, very challenging anti-poverty program of the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, the largest workfare program in human history. There are many other issues there, but I like that point, and I think there's a whole lot of interesting discussion that could come out of that. Akiko's point on political economy of anti-poverty policy, I could talk a lot about this. It's specific to certain policies, why they exist. I think some generic issues. One of the things that I've become fascinated with is the moral hazard in levels of government with regard to political economy. So all over the world, I think we increasingly rely on local governments to implement anti-poverty policies, and they're in a moral hazard situation because the central government is going to have to deal with major protection problems, major crises, famines and so on, right? And we see this, so local governments are often putting a higher weight on promotion, the distinction between protection and promotion. In the political economy, local governments, in my view, tend to take a higher weight on promotion than protection because of the moral hazard situation. And that's an aspect of the political economy that interfacing with incentives at different levels of government and fiscal federalism that I think is under-researched and very interesting, something we should understand better. I see this, for example, in the largest anti-poverty program in the world by far, the DBAO program in China. It's a minimum income guarantee. It's supposed to bring everybody up to a guaranteed minimum income. But when you look at the operation of that scheme, there's a huge disconnect. In other words, China doesn't have, the centre doesn't have the terms of the contract to deal with the agency problems of this particular scheme. So essentially the centre has one objective, which puts higher weight on protection relative to promotion. And local implementing agents have a different objective, which puts much more weight on promotion relative to protection, coming partly out of this moral hazard problem, I believe. It's my interpretation. But that disconnect between the objectives makes it means, in fact, that the scheme on paper is not what's actually happening in reality. And that's part of the political economy. But there's so many other things we could talk about there. I mean, aspects of the political economy permeate everything in anti-poverty policy. I also resist a little bit thinking about political economy is a constraint, but it's also something that you manipulate. We're all in the business of advocacy as well as analysis, in my view, and we should recognise that fact. So political economy is something you kind of see, you deal with, but it's not the same nature of constraint as many other things. Information is another example. I mean, information is a huge constraint on anti-poverty policy, but we should also be in the business of changing information, using technology, using data. We have to. It's a funny kind of thing how we deal with those constraints. This is something I'm sure François is worried about, and others, and is important. I don't have any simple answer to that. Denis' point. When I say that. This is a little bit semantic, but when I say that I think we've reached a social consensus on this is to say that I think there's broad agreement in society now on the objective. How to get there is a different thing altogether, and there we've got not much agreement at all. So I'm just saying that I think there's a consensus across the left and the right, across the world today. This is a bold statement, and I can't prove it, but I think that is defensible. On poverty reduction, you'll get people on the right who will just say, "Yeah, sure, but we should look after the poor." You even got Donald Trump saying, "What did he say? That we don't want people dying in the streets." Wow. Anyway. No. I think you get most people actually do think about poverty by the standards of the country they live in. Donald Trump is maybe a bit exceptional, but I would actually argue that the nature of the consensus is socially specific too. I don't think people in America think about poverty by any other standard but an American standard. They probably think the social subjective poverty line in the US is definitely above $13 per person per day, which is the official poverty line. I'm not sure how far above it is, but it's certainly above it. I'm convinced of that. But that's because the official poverty line has a political resistance to changing the official poverty line. Another interesting example on political economy is that the inertia we see in poverty measures and poverty lines, which is understandable. It's one of the hardest things for governments to change. I worked on the new official poverty lines for China, and I know how hard that was. The issue of changing the poverty line in China went to the very top in decision making. That was such a hard thing to do. China doubled its poverty line overnight. Some other points. I don't have anything to add on the question from the gentleman in Peru. I'm kind of sympathetic with the question, but I don't have anything much to say about that. I'm sorry. My sympathy is on the issue. I don't take the view that the financial sector is the main source of global inequality, but it's certainly something that has been part of the inequality story in places like America, no question. François, something you say?
Yes, we have other questions which were sent by email, but I think that the person who sent that question is in the room and could have asked the question himself. But let me read it to you, and if he wants to add something, he will. The question is the following. Who should decide what is poverty and how to measure it? If economists do it on their own, don't they impose their views, the views of technocrats, on people mired in poverty and reinforce the voicelessness and powerlessness of the latter? Should not people living in poverty be associated to its definition with experts and practitioners in a new process of deliberative democracy to determine the dimensions of poverty and how to measure them? And this is signed by Xavier Godineau and Joseph Wosinski. Xavier Godino from the ATD Carmonde organization. And Xavier is here in the room.
To make a round of questions, but I like that question so much that I'll jump in. I completely agree. I mean, that's why I emphasize this point about the social... Hand up, okay. That's why I was emphasizing this point about the social subjective poverty line. This is I think it's actually the only legitimate concept of poverty. One that is entirely built up from the views that individuals have of what poverty means. It is not imposed. The analyst's role is very passive and minor. You build it up by asking, essentially, the origin of the idea was back to the 1960s in Holland, and the origin of the idea was to ask each person, what is the minimum income you need to make ends meet? That's a typical way of framing it. And you ask that of each individual, and then you compare that to their actual income. Yeah? These are objective things. You ask people this question, you get a very high response rate on that question. I probably get a more reliable answer on that question than I get about income. That's another issue. There are all kinds of techie issues here about measurement error that we could mention, but I'm not going to go into them. So you ask people, what is your minimum income? Then I ask you what your actual income is. And of course I find that the higher your actual income, the higher the minimum income you think is needed to make ends meet. But every time you do this, there's a fixed point in the relationship. There's a point above which people's actual income exceeds the minimum, and below which, the opposite. So we have a natural concept for what I call the social subjective poverty line. Now the trouble is you can't implement that concept in rural India. Forget it. What is this thing, income? How do you define it? What does it mean? There's an alternative approach which I've developed based on asking people questions about consumption adequacy. You go through, do you think your food consumption is adequate for your needs? Do you think your clothing is adequate for your needs? Your transport, your health? And you build it up that way to find this magic point. But that is not imposed. I mean, the idea is coming from economists, but it's based on the data, the perceptions of poverty of people themselves. And that's why I think it has such traction in countries, because it is the point above which people tend to think they're not poor, below which they tend to think they're poor. So I fully agree. And I'd love to see every country in the world do it this way. I think we'd really have a powerful concept. I also argue that is actually what is happening. People are implementing the social subjective poverty line because no statistics agency will ever go out there and produce a poverty number which is going to get laughed at. They're trying to find that magic point. They want to produce a poverty number, a poverty line, and that will be be accepted in that society. And it's the nature of that social specificity that is key here.
Okay, thank you. We have time for a second round of questions. Okay, the lady over there at the back.
Hello, I have a question looking at the history of thought on poverty. Do you think that including...
Can you speak up or have the mic closer to your mouth?
I have a question regarding the evolution of thought on poverty. Do you think that the next step is to take into account climate change? Because like in a fairness perspective, this is how like donors from predominantly rich countries influence the most developing countries, and there is a broad consensus that it will have dramatic consequences, for instance, like just to name sea level. So that's the first question. My second question is, why do you think that so far development has not taken this aspect in the development field? Why have economists not taken that into account in the development field? Because, and the third question is, how do you think there can be rapid change and progress on this issue?
Okay, thank you very much. Hector?
Hi, Hector. I also studied at the Paris School of Economics, or as you mentioned it in the class, at the Paris School of Measurement. So I'm going to ask on the measurement issue, referring to
So embarrassing.
referring to this devotion. And so you've mentioned about the poverty and inequality. So I'm wondering, so which direction should the research on poverty and measure and inequality should follow in terms of measurement? So which are the appropriate research areas to go in terms of measurement of poverty and inequality, if you can mention?
Okay, thank you. The gentleman in blue pullover.
Yeah. Thank you. I have a question on intentionality of the change that we want to see or that we don't want to see. I'll get to that. It's my observation that the path that most developed countries have followed is to first reduce poverty at the same time that inequality goes up, and then reduce inequality. I have in mind, for example, Britain. First, Britain developed. There was the Industrial Revolution, and then they had their welfare state. And that's also my impression that some of the developing countries right now are going through that process. So I ask my question, can we skip this process? I mean, can we reduce poverty and inequality at the same time? And I will refer back to one of the questions of Professor Bourguignon, that why can't we do better? I understand your point, and I understand you devote in your book a section on how there is consensus on poverty reduction, and how that's already been asked, but not necessarily in the reduction of inequality. And we talk about that a lot here in the Paris School of Economics. And I'm thinking about inequality both between countries and within countries. I think, for example, that the role of targeting, like the emphasis that people put on targeting, comes from the belief that we rather help a specific group get out of poverty than change a society altogether. Because I believe that really targeting inequality as a whole requires a different society, like a different country almost. Like really reducing inequality requires a structural change. So my question is the developed world happy with the reduction of inequality, meaning that it will require societies to change as a whole? And that's my question on intentionality. Like, do you devote a section on your book about who wants inequality to go down or who doesn't want inequality to go down? I'm not a Marxist, and I'm not going to throw a Marxist argument here, but my question is, do you ask that question?
Okay, thank you. There are two questions over there. Yes. The mic, please.
I have a question on trade policy. To what extent do you think changes in the European and North American trade policy could help to reduce extreme poverty?
Okay, Xavier.
Yes, first of all, thank you for your exciting presentation. I have a question about the measurement of poverty. Did you address in your book the issue of people who are invisible in statistics? Somebody says that millions or 100 millions of people are invisible in statistics. What do you think about it? And how, what policies could improve this statistic? First question. And second question is about anti-poverty policy that turn into anti-poor policies. And I'm thinking especially of policies of sterilization that occurred in many countries in the North and the South, even in recent years. Many atrocious things appeared and many governments apologized for what happened. And my question is, do you think there are nowadays such policies which are harming very strongly poor people, which are invisible and who could become visible in the next years? Okay, can you think of several fields of these kind of policies? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Martin, do you want to go over this round of questions?
Okay. Clearly, the book is not long enough. I realized that one of the decisions I made was not to go much into environmental stuff, environmental economics. That's not, I think it's unimportant. In fact, I think the nexus of environment poverty issues and things like the cost to poor people of climate change, and they're hugely important. I talk at times about climate change and those costs, but I don't give it a lot of attention. So that's an inadequacy of the book. But I actually don't think it's right to say that economists are ignoring this issue at all. I think that's really wrong. I don't identify at all with that comment. I see economists looking a lot at that issue. And when I was director of the research department, we had it was one of the top issues we were looking at in the research department of the World Bank. So I don't agree on that point. Hector's comment on measurement priorities going forward. I'd like to see, I think there's a lot of scope for, this actually relates to the last point as well. There's a last question. I think there's a lot of scope for a better linking, understanding perceptions of poverty and inequality, lay perceptions, how people understand these concepts. And I think there's a kind of disconnect. I see all the time we have these formal concepts which we develop, nice axioms of inequality or poverty measurement, and nice theorems, and we're finding the measure that satisfies these axioms, and so on. And I don't put that down at all. Great, but there is when you carry these concepts to policy, you go through a public debate. Everything we do in anti-poverty policy as analysts is to contribute to a public debate. And the trouble is, we're often armed with tools that aren't understood by people in this debate, or, more profoundly, they have a fundamentally different concept. They have a different set of axioms. And I think that understanding, I mentioned that in my main talk, but I think that understanding goes much further than I suggested to many areas. It is something that comes out repeatedly in the book. But we haven't done, think of this, we have that survey I did of my students, it's so easy. Frank Cowell and Miel did this very nice book on this in 1993, I think, as I recall. Also asking university students about their concepts of inequality. We've never done that. I've been saying this for years. Let's do that on a national survey. Let's try to understand why some people think about inequality one way or another way. It's so important to the policy debate. It's not even that we wouldn't necessarily agree. We may think that that's not that we may say it's a defective concept. We may have a debate about the concept. But let's understand the concepts of poverty and inequality that people actually do have much better, and I think that would be a high priority in my view. But it hasn't happened. We've never done, to my knowledge, a national sample survey which did that. And that's I'm maybe partly to blame for not realizing its importance before. The question from the gentleman in the blue pullover, who was also very patient before, I noticed. Thank you. In a sense, you might be right if it wasn't for the fact that the targeting is so bad in one sense. When people talk about targeting, they're really talking about minimizing areas of inclusion. It's really making sure that non-poor people don't get benefits from policies. And this is dangerous, very dangerous indeed, because your impact on poverty depends as much or more on the areas of exclusion. When you exclude poor people from the benefits of policies, most of our anti-poverty policies, now almost every country in the developing world has some form of social assistance policy. That's a dramatic change. That wasn't true 20 years ago. The share of the population of the developing world which is covered by some form of social assistance is increasing now at 3.5 percentage points per year. That's extraordinary. The growth of social protection, social assistance policy in the developing world is a phenomenon. But there's a lot more to do in making those policies effective. And one of the things is to assure more complete coverage. The emphasis on targeting, I repeat that from my talk. Your other point that was sort of more a clarification, but your main point about can developing countries reduce poverty and inequality at the same time? Well, half the countries that are reducing poverty are reducing inequality. It's not true that it's relative inequality. It's not true that it's increasing in all developing, all poor countries which are seeing poverty reduction. Now, big exceptions are the two biggest countries, China and India, where inequality is rising while poverty is falling. But there's plenty to learn from other cases. There's no inevitability to that. Sub-Saharan Africa has a huge inequality challenge, which it's really got to deal with if it's going to make, in my view, any traction in longer-term poverty reduction. And I think there's much for Sub-Saharan Africa to learn from others. Trade policy, what was the question? Can trade policy reduce extreme poverty? Was that the question?
Yes.
Yes. Doesn't mean it's straight, conventional, liberalizing trade policy, but maybe it is, depends on the circumstances. I actually don't think it's a first order issue, trade policy for poverty reduction. This is a debate, but I'm a kind of trade skeptic. I think it's one of the things you need to worry about, but I'm not a major advocate of trade liberalization policy as an instrument for poverty reduction. I think it can have a role in some circumstances, but it's not a huge deal. The reason I'm skeptical of it is that I see many cases where poverty's fallen rapidly without trade liberalization. Trade liberalization can be poverty increasing in some circumstances, and it's a very mixed record. The kinds of generalizations that people have routinely made, economists have routinely made about this, have not really held up to close scrutiny empirically. The situation is much more complex. Standard arguments based on Hesho, theorems, and so on, just not what we see. If anything, in developing poor countries, trade liberalization, if anything, has been more inequality increasing than decreasing, for example. But there's many more things one could say about that. I think the more general point about is the agenda for liberalizing markets pro-poor? Yes, if you're liberalizing markets from the point of view of poor people, making market-friendly policies more friendly to poor people, worrying about the markets that they derive their incomes from, is a huge agenda. What we're seeing is a lot of market-friendly policies for rich people. What we now need to see is a lot of emphasis on making markets work better for poor people. That is and trade folds into that to some extent. That's a short answer to what could be a very long answer. A short version of what could be a very long answer. Okay.
I want to address the issue of missing people.
Oh, the missing people. Yeah, the book does talk about that from a statistical point of view, and it is an issue. The main area it's an issue is missing rich people, not missing poor people. By and large, poor people have much higher participation rates in household surveys than rich people. I'm studying this in a few countries. I started off in the US. It's very clear that I figure the probability of participating in the current population survey, falls. The probability of participation falls from about 90%, 95%. In other words, 95% of poor people, when they get asked to do an interview, they do it, and they're available for the interview in the CPS. For rich people, it falls to about 50% on average. And that's a huge error. That selective compliance with the survey is a huge error in the measurement of poverty and inequality in the US. It makes very little difference to the poverty measure, a little bit, not much. Obviously, the poverty measure is a bit lower than we thought, but inequality makes a huge difference. I figure that bias in the CPS in the US reduces the Gini index by about 5%. In other words, the true index is 5 percentage points higher than it really is, because of the selective compliance in the survey. But much bigger problem at the other end of the distribution. Now, there are some serious measurement problems. Obviously, doing household surveys for homeless people is a well-recognised issue, but that's, statisticians do try to deal with that. The bigger problem, I mean, that's a national issue, but I'd say empirically the far bigger problem is selective compliance on the part of rich people.
Okay, I think that we reached the time limit. So I think that we now have to thank you very much, Martin, for this very, very nice session, very nice book launch. So we have to hope that you will be selling a lot of books. We'll see, maybe we could make a statistic on how many books will be sold around this part of Paris. Thank you very much.